Hello, welcome again to FAIRtax Power Radio. I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Bob Scarborough.
And we are the FAIRtax Guys.
Yes, sir, buddy.
All right. Well, I tell you
Rubik's
what.
Cube to end all Rubik's Cubes.
Yes, well, this is the complexity of the income tax.
Looks like my front doormat.
Yeah, well, I really haven't scrambled it up as good as I normally do because it takes about an hour and a half to put this back together.
Oh,
it's not any harder than the other ones. It just takes longer.
Not going anywhere for a while.
Oh, well, that'll do it. But I say we took those down to CPAC and they were a hit when people could see my little 2x2, which represented the FAIRtax, and this big 11x11 all scrambled up represented the it did catch some people's attention as they were walking by us. So
it was trending on Twitter there for about an hour.
Yeah, well, hopefully we got some good video at CPAC, and we can hopefully put it all together and make a pretty good FAIRtax Power Radio episode out of that here shortly, maybe even next week. But
coming up real soon, yes, sir, everybody.
As of for now, it's been a while since I have been able to dig into Congress.gov. And my favorite, you rub your hands there. That's my favorite part of the show.
Parts of the show.
Well, again, we always say that the best argument we can make for getting rid of the income tax is showing people A, what's in it, and B, what the Congress critters are trying to put in it.
Absolutely. It's just every day your chin just goes.
Yeah. Well, as of the day we're recording this, if you go to congress.gov, you type the words Internal Revenue Code, put that in quotes, put that in the search function up there at the top of the page, hit the go button. As of the day we're recording this, you get 1,482 hits on that search. And excuse me, most of what I noticed when I went out there today to dig this stuff up was things that illustrate that the income tax code, the IRS code, is really built on shifting sand. It never stays the same. What is a good decision today becomes a bad decision, in a matter of months.
Depends on who's in charge.
Because they change the rules all the time.
Yeah.
So I came up with several things that just, again, illustrate the instability and the constantly changing nature of the tax code. And that is something that, of course, gives businesses a headache when they can't figure out what the tax code is going to be 6 months from now. But let's start with
long-range plans. You just can't make long-range plans when it changes.
Individuals can't either. So here we go. Let's start with S 3625. A bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to temporarily reinstate the employee retention credit for employers subject to closure during COVID-19. Now, you read that, it says temporarily reinstate the employee retention credit. That means they had it at one time, took it away, either that or it expired. And now they want, they want to temporarily put it back, which means after it's been back for a while, it's going to go away a second time. How can you do? I see the hands in the head there. How can you do long-range planning when the tax code is constantly changing like that?
Shifting sand is the best analogy I've heard in a while. It's like going to the Outer Banks and trying to build a house on the land that's already been consumed by the Atlantic Ocean. If anybody look at historical pictures of the north end of Topsail Island, for example.
Yeah, well, I'd go down. My mom used to have a timeshare on Sunset Beach there in North Carolina. And you'd go out to the end of the thing, and it would look radically different every day because the current and the waves are always constantly beating on it. And that's what the tax code is. It is always changing. Dig this one, HR 6658, to amend the Internal Revenue Code to make permanent certain provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act affecting individuals, families, and small businesses. Now, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was enacted in 2017. But this tells you that even when you have something like that, there are provisions in there that are temporary, and you have to come back later and pass another bill to make them permanent, and then they'll take them away again. And
then something might change in the middle of that. There might be, with two more cycles through. We got some new members of Congress. We're going to change it a little bit to do this, and it would never gets back to looking like it did the first go round. So.
Well, that's HR 6658, sponsored by Representative Rodney Davis of Illinois. 89 co-sponsors on that one. That's fairly impressive.
Yeah.
Shall we continue? HR 6644, to amend the Internal Revenue Code to repeal the production tax credit and the investment tax credit. Again, something was given and now they want to take it away, and somebody else will give it back later and then they'll take it away again.
It doesn't quite fit the model of what is needed today by whoever's in office. It's not, it really becomes, a personal way that the Congress members utilize the tax code, and why they have to utilize a tax code, who knows? Maybe it's because that's where things start. But they have to. It's not anything that may or may not make it out of the starting gate. But if it does, it's obviously going to take time for it to get to the White House for a president's signature. But there's some other reason why this tax code has to continually be manipulated. And I scratch my head till I lose all my hair, because it's like, why are we putting up with this? Why does the citizenry of the United States have to put up with this? Why does that have to happen?
Because most people are not paying attention to what Congress is doing, and they get away with this because nobody's looking.
What was that? Oh, Congress.gov. We ought to have a bell hooked up like you used to cross over the wire on the ground to get your gas, and you had full service. Bing.
Oh, and yeah. I'm old enough to remember those. You're had a little hose out there, and you'd
and it would ring the bell in the garage. And
that was back when the guy would come out and fill your tank for you. I'm old enough to remember that. Now
you check under the hood and wash your windows.
Mm-hmm.
That little bell, every time Congress.gov, every time it's loaded with an additional entry from our representative, we ought to be able to.
Well,
that would be crazy. That'd drive me nuts. I'd have to go cut the bell.
It would have rung 1,482 times since the beginning of Congress. Now, here's one that actually sounds kind of good to an old geezer like me. The HR 6590, the Senior Citizens Tax Elimination Act. And it's not quite as comprehensive as the title would have you believe. This is to amend the Internal Revenue Code to repeal the inclusion in gross income of Social Security benefits. In other words, your Social Security would no longer be taxable. It's kind of taxable in part now. But again, that gets back to something our economics professor told us. One of the hardest things about having an income tax is defining what's income, what counts to be taxed and what doesn't.
And we've got to look at all of it to make that decision. That's what the IRS would say. Oh, we have to see all of what you have, even the stuff you stole. If you remember a few episodes back, we talked about. I laugh every time I think about that. If you stole something, you need to make sure that you report it on form, blah, blah, blah.
Yes, that is an IRS publication 17. You can go check that out. And one more here that's actually going to lead right into what we wanted to talk about on FAIRtax Power Radio today. This is a bill from Senator Scott here in Florida, S 3599, the Ban IRS Biometrics Act, to amend the Internal Revenue Code to prohibit the Internal Revenue Service from requiring taxpayers to provide biometric information. And I dug into the text a little bit, and it said, not later than 180 days after the date of the enactment of this act, the Secretary of the Treasury or such secretary's delegate, in consultation with the Director of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, those folks shall develop a plan for the safe and secure destruction and disposal of any biometric information as defined in Section 7531B of the Internal Revenue Code. That they're just going to make sure that stuff is destroyed and can't be used against you.
Oh, yeah.
Because it came out not long ago that the IRS wanted to start collecting biometric information. You sent me an article about it. Jade Wiley sent me an article about it. Steve Hayes wrote a chairman's report on it.
Right.
But that they wanted, right now, you can create an account on IRS.gov and see your own information using just your standard logon credentials, a user ID and password. But they wanted to beef that up and make you require a biometric, a face scan and stuff like that.
Have your face. And I was in South Carolina. The Department of Transportation, had your driver's license picture there and everything. And then the news came out. This has been a decade or so ago, maybe more, maybe 20 years, maybe 15 or 20 years now. But they said, okay, we're going to sell your driver's license picture to this company. And nobody got, as the people whose pictures were on the driver's license, we said, okay, well, what? You're going to sell it to this private company, and what are they going to do with it?
How big a cut do I get of that?
Yeah, I'm going to go to which picture was it? Because there's a lot of driver's license pictures that I've had over the years that I absolutely, I look, like a felon. But how poor you really want to, go to Olin Mills to get a picture. If you want to have a picture done, you want to make it look right. You don't want to have it look bad. But so anyway, so all of a sudden our identity is tied to sensitive data. And especially we know how hackers are. We don't want our picture associated with, with some nefarious activity, stealing our identity. And we know how all of that goes. And there are a lot of companies out there that battle against the dark web. And, they say have a fee that they charge. So here's the Internal Revenue Service using facial recognition through a company called ID.me, ID.me.
Mm-hmm.
And
so, but you remember a while back when we were looking at the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights that the right to privacy is one of them. And they said, your information cannot be disclosed without your consent, blah, 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 blah. And then the ProPublica leak came along. Right. That data is not safe. The IRS cannot be trusted to hold that. And can you imagine if you have an untrustworthy agency like the IRS in possession of your face scan, electronic fingerprint? Can you imagine that the havoc that an identity thief could wreak upon you if he could get a hold of that stuff? And can you imagine just somebody with a political agenda leaking that information on people that he disagrees with and doesn't like? I'm positive that's what happened to the ProPublica case.
It's anything's possible. But the thing about the visual ID, and it comes from a very benevolent position of, well, we want to make sure that nobody else is able to get in and see your information. But there again, at the same time, your face is associated with all of your sensitive data that the Internal Revenue Service keeps on you, including your Social Security number.
Okay, but now you're saying they backed off on that a bit.
Well, they have. About a month ago, on February 7th, a New York Times article basically says that the Internal Revenue Service will end use of facial recognition for identity verification after, and this is quoting from the Times, after a bipartisan backlash, the agency will transition away from using a service from ID.me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I got a better idea. Why don't we just get rid of the Internal Revenue Service altogether?
Simple, easy peasy. Let's do it. FAIRtax.org has all the information on how we can make this happen. And as we've said in previous episodes, we've found out, and we've known probably for a long time, and really, why are we not getting any traction? The simplest way to get traction in Congress on the fair tax, or moving to a tax on consumption from the income tax and getting rid of the Internal Revenue Service, is to make sure that we call our elected officials. Get your friends, family members, get the dogs, cats, neighbors, people passing by on the street. Let them know this is what needs to happen. Give them the telephone numbers to the Congress switchboard, to the White House switchboard. Let's flood those phone numbers. Those telephones need to be ringing off the hook up there in Washington. And the other end of the phone is you saying, we need to get rid of the Internal Revenue Service. We need to move from a tax on income and to a tax on consumption through the fair tax,
Absolutely. But talking about the big bad IRS, the abuses, we've highlighted several abuses that the Internal Revenue Service foists on people. I dug back, I found an article by a gentleman named James Bovard called The Sordid History of IRS Political Abuse. Now, remember that the income tax came into being in 1913. Okay. Yes. And a quote from this article: the IRS has a long history of trying to ruin the political careers of its critics. In 1925, when the fair tax was just 12 years old, in 1925, Internal Revenue Commissioner David Blair personally delivered a demand for $10 million in back taxes to Michigan's Republican Senator James Cousins, who had launched an investigation into the Bureau of Internal Revenue. And he stepped up to him as he was leaving the Senate chamber and demanded $10 million in back taxes. And of course, the guy fought it. Says no way. He eventually proved he had actually overpaid his taxes by roughly $1 million. And that's back in 1925. Imagine what that would be worth in today's figures. But the precedent of using threats to deflect oversight was firmly established very early in the IRS's career.
And the opportunity, people are looking for opportunities like that to, how can I get the one up, or you're going to do that to me. Well, here, watch this. I've got this tool in my toolkit, and it does, and it's the Internal Revenue Service. In addition to the Internal Revenue Service, a lot of, in my opinion, the bureaucracy has become more politicized over time. Both parties using the bureaucracy to best their opponents at every turn or at most turns. And I guess you go back and you say, okay, well, the days of the citizen legislator are over. Statesmanship has been totally stabbed to death and left bleeding on the floor in the Congress. And so you kind of think, well, if we pay more attention to what's going on, then we can find good people to go and do their term, come back. So we're talking about term limits, because it certainly has turned into a career path for a lot of people.
This same article went on to mention that President Franklin Roosevelt used the IRS to harass newspaper publishers, including William Randolph Hearst and Moses Annenberg, who was a publisher of the Philadelphia Inquirer. He dropped the IRS hammer on political rivals like Huey Long and Father Coughlin, and prominent Republicans like former Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon. So abuse back in 1925, abuse back in the mid-40s. And of course, everyone remembers, or at least everybody our age anyway, remembers Richard Nixon's infamous enemies list and how he sicked the IRS on them.
And so I guess the culture then reflects that use of the agency, of the Internal Revenue Service. The culture then becomes, how can I impress my boss being, the Congress or being the president, et cetera.
This article says more than 10,000 groups and individuals were targeted by the Nixon administration because of their political activism and slant between 1969 and 1973. That included the John Birch Society and Nobel laureate Linus Pauling. The IRS was given a list of Nixon's official enemies. So in the words of White House counsel John Dean at the time, quote, "We could use the available federal machinery to screw our political enemies." Now, does that sound like a system that we should allow to remain in place?
That's the thing. It becomes so simple. And this whole thing you can walk, it's like a house of glass windows. You can walk around outside of the house and look at each side or the corner or the preface and look in, and it's the same house, but it looks different every angle that you look at. So you have abuse of power, you have crazy rules that you have to follow. You have in order to pay your taxes. We have to know everything that you make so we can find whether or not we need to use that as income or not. So just tell us everything that goes on in your life. Or Congress going out there and saying we're going to use the tax code to do certain things. So that house of glass, it's the same house, the Internal Revenue Service, but it's a different piece every time. Everything you look at, there's a different view inside every time you move around to a different section.
Yeah, well, I go back to something that Mo Brooks said. We cannot get rid of the Internal Revenue Service, and we cannot pass the fair tax until there is enough grassroots support to make it, an election tipping issue at the ballot box. If you support the fair tax, we'll vote for you. If you don't, we'll vote against you. And until there are enough votes to make some differences in some of these elections, then we're going to be stuck with this IRS, and we really need to get rid of it. So you need to get rid of it by, as you mentioned earlier, calling your Congress people. Let's go to popvox.com. Tell your Congress people that you want the fair tax, that you want to get rid of the Internal Revenue Service. It's been described, Ron Malero would call it a criminal organization, and I think he's pretty well right on that.
Well, I mean, yeah, there's so many. It's utilized. The agency is utilized in a number of different ways that aren't necessarily to the benefit of not only the people who are the enemies of the person using it, but also, or the competitors of the person using it, but also to us, to the average person who is caught in this vicious cycle of collecting all of the things that represent what I spent my money on, where I made my money, and now here we are in the cycle of the tax season, and we're all can't wait to get our tax refund, which we should have anyway. We should go ahead and have that in our pocket every month.
Well, that's our money. And any tax refund you get is actually an interest-free loan that you have made to the government.
Yeah, and I want my money. I want my tax refund so I can go buy a 65-inch color TV, with the internet hooked up to it. I can't wait. So imagine having that money in your pocket, plus the benefit of not having to have your employer take out the taxes that he's responsible paying for. And imagine the opportunity you would have to save. That's the big thing for me, is with the Internal Revenue Service out of the picture. You can now focus on your family first, and you can save money instead of having to look for or not make enough to make ends meet. I think that's the biggest thing, especially
as you've mentioned before. As you mentioned before here, nobody who is working for a living today has known any other system other than the income tax, and people just accept it because it was there when I was born. That's just the way it's always been, and people do not understand that there is an alternative. That's why I love our catchphrase: once you understand it, you'll demand it. When enough people realize that, hey, the government does not have to take a big chunk of my paycheck before I get it. The government does not have to make me disclose all of my financial dealings to them on a tax return. I can get a tax refund every month instead of once a year, maybe. Once people understand how the fair tax works and what the benefits to them are, I think they will. Once you understand it, you'll demand it. I love that phrase. It's just something that Ron Malero and I came up with. And of course, I kind of feel like since he had a hand in coming up with that, we're honoring his legacy every time we mention those words.
Well, that's very true. And it makes sense. It's a nice, quick, comes off the tongue easy. And the other side of it is too, because sometimes you have a conversation, well, it's a conservative, or it's a liberal thing, or it's Democrat or Republican. The good thing about the fair tax is it's nonpartisan. Everybody gets the benefit, everybody. And everybody comes into the responsibility of paying the tax at the cash register when you make a retail purchase or buy a service that's new. If it's used, tax has already been paid on it. All the benefits that you know about that you've heard us talk about here on the program on a regular basis. And it's not. And the thing about it is we don't get into talking about how the money that the federal government is getting is going to be used. We don't talk about, we would certainly hope that, people in the future Congresses that are dealing at this level will say, okay, we want to We want to be able to pay down the debt now that we're getting all this money in. There are great experiences that are to be found to help people, for those who are socially minded, to allow for those folks who have to get a current benefit from the government, whether it be through Medicaid or Medicare, your Social Security. None of those agencies, none of those entitlements are touched by a switch from the income tax to the fair tax, a tax on consumption. And I always try to say tax on consumption when I say fair tax, because a lot of people say, oh, fair tax, flat tax, it rolls off the tongue just as easy.
Yes. Go back and listen to Jade Wally's last Wally's World if you want to know the difference between the fair tax and the flat tax.
Right. I think that was episode 301. I'll have to make sure that it's within the couple of last 3 or 4 episodes. Fair tax, it ain't the same as the flat tax.
Not even close.
Flat tax retains the Internal Revenue Service. It's still a tax on income. And folks, it's a bipartisan deal. Please understand that this is going to benefit everybody, one side or the other. And we're still going to have an opportunity to debate in Congress and the Senate on how that money that's coming into the government is spent. That's a whole total different deal. That's another department. That doesn't belong to the fair tax.
Okay, well,
issue doesn't belong to the fair
then
tax.
again, if we're going to get rid of the Internal Revenue Service, people again need to understand that they don't have to be part of their life. There is an alternative. It's called a fair tax, and if you can elect enough candidates like we've talked to here on the program that have signed the pledge, they are running on the fair tax, make it an issue in your campaign, make it an issue with your local politicians. Let them know that you want it and you're going to expect them to vote for it, and it's going to affect your vote one way or the other, whether they support it or whether they don't. But yeah, you can have your whole paycheck. You don't have to file an income tax return. You can get a tax refund every month. The IRS can be, as we say, tossed on the scrap heap of history so that nobody ever has to deal with the internal. Can you bet? Granddad, can you tell me what this IRS was? I don't know what that is. Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Imagine the relief, because you hear all these horror stories about people who are audited or spent 5 years and tens of thousands of dollars being investigated, businesses, individuals who may have made a simple mistake, but of course you're guilty until proven innocent with the Internal Revenue Service. When it comes to an accounting error of some kind, that whole psychological blanket that comes down on top of you when you have that fear of something like that happening. And I think somehow the Internal Revenue Service enjoys having that to lord over people.
Well, if you want to help us get rid of the Internal Revenue Service, share these videos to your social media, advocate for it on social media, and just make the fair tax something that you really want to see and act accordingly. And that's going to wrap up this edition of FAIRtax Power Radio. We're flat out of time again. I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Bob Scarborough.
The FAIRtax Guys reminding you again that the fair tax is the only truly fair tax, and once you understand it,
you'll demand it.
The FAIRtax is a tax replacement plan where we take all the federal income taxes, including corporate, personal, gift, and estate taxes, and replace them with one national consumption tax on new purchases above the poverty level only. This form of consumption tax comes with no exceptions and is progressive, not regressive. The poor are not paying more, and the rich are not paying less. What makes it progressive is that all Americans are untaxed up to the poverty level via the prebate, much like your standard tax deduction. The taxes are collected by retail businesses at state level, so the system is more accountable. The IRS is done away with, and you have control over your money and what the overall tax rate your household pays. The fair tax is revenue neutral, so the government receives the same amount of money as they do now. And it's fair because you decide what's fair, not them. To learn more, visit FAIRtax.org and be sure to like us on social media to help educate your friends and spread the word.